Hello, folks. Welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is the warrior women of Meroe, ancient queenship in the kingdom of Kush. So, welcome to Warrior Women Week. Both this and the next lecture on the Amazons follow a certain theme. Um, One of the ways in which stereotypes drive our view of the ancient world when it comes to gender roles is that we don't really take into account that women, especially elite women, are not always severely restricted in what they can do. That is an interpretation that's driven by a perhaps undue focus on the quote unquote great civilizations of the classical world. AKA, just because the Greeks were a little nuts on the subject doesn't mean that everyone else was too. Now, to illustrate this, it's probably best to look for what you might call the more extreme examples where women actually take on military roles. The interesting twist there is that we do hear about these women, usually from sources external to their civilization. So looking at the differences between reality and how they're portrayed can be quite instructive. So let's talk about Meroe. Meroe is actually the final and most significant capital of the kingdom of Kush, which is another civilization of the Nile Valley, in this case the Upper Nile, which is in what's now Sudan. It is an important neighbor to Egypt. Now, a very quick history. Kush was created by the Nubian people of the Upper Nile. There are close connections between the Nubians and ancient Egypt from the period of the Old Kingdom onwards. Now, Egypt got a little too close to the Nubians by 1500 BCE and wound up exerting power over the Nubian hinterland because it needed to control trade. So, Egyptian cultural influence is very noticeable in the area and amongst the ruling class. Egypt withdraws from the area not long after the late Bronze Age collapse. The Nubians began to create a new kingdom of their own, called Kush by the Egyptians and modeled after Egyptian governmental structures and practices. Now, they actually invaded Egypt around 730 BCE and took over Thebes. And in the Egyptian historical records, they're called the Ethiopian dynasty or the 25th dynasty. They governed Egypt for 60 years, but they did so in a way that was virtually indistinguishable from the Egyptian native dynasties. Now, they were driven out by the Assyrians in the 7th century and then withdrew to Nubia. They reestablished themselves first at Napata, which is also on that map, and then at Meroe, which was much more secure from invasion from the direction of Egypt. Now, Meroe, again, is much further south. It's near the 6th cataract of the Nile. It had very ample resources of iron and hardwood available. This helped it with its military readiness as well as with its agriculture, as long as they had the iron tools. It was well placed for trade as well, both trade to Egypt and a connection to the Red Sea. It was able to export luxury goods like ostrich feathers, gold, ivory, ebony, leopard skins. Government was not over-centralized. Taxes were paid by the peasants, but they weren't rigorously assessed. And Meroe itself was a fairly large city for its time. It was about a square mile in area, and it included large reservoirs to catch rainfall. Now, in 2002, archaeologists detected a large palace buried in the sand and began to work on excavating it. Now, what we know about the monarchy at Meroe is that the king was an absolute monarch, but a new candidate for the kingship had to be approved by the nobles and by the priests. Some who were unpopular were actually removed, and the king's mother exerted enormous influence. And we'll talk more about that, obviously. Now, the kings of Meroe were still influenced by Egyptian culture, but in the Meroitic period, there was more of an individual and distinctive culture that developed. Their own language replaced Egyptian. They came up with a new script, which we haven't deciphered fully. Egyptian gods continued to be worshipped, but new gods were added. Probably the most important was Epidemic, the lion god of the southern Nile. This is a warrior god who is also a god of wisdom and learning. They actually built pyramids, and I'll show you an image in a moment. These are much smaller and steeper than the Egyptian variety. Unfortunately, the tops of many of them got knocked off in the 19th century with people looking for treasure. There are actually many, many more pyramids in Kush than there are in Egypt, over 200 that we know of. Now, obviously, this is not a civilization that has been investigated for a significant amount of time, due partially to the location. It is hard to dig in Sudan, not just physically hard because of the environment, but also because of the politics and the political situation that's been an issue there for a long time. But also because there's a certain sort of inbred bias about Nubia and Kush. They had been assumed to be just an offshoot of Egypt. They were not generally seen as an independent civilization. This is not true. Like, this is a real misconception. But because archaeologists had that misconception, they didn't dig for a long time. And so we are still playing catch up with Meroe. There is the image of the pyramids, just to give you an idea of what they look like. All right, to understand Meroe, you have to take it further away from Egyptian influence and understand that it's more like the Sudanic states that would follow it. Again, the problem is that it was defined for so long as an offshoot of Egypt. So only recently have people looked at it as an African civilization. So this, by the way, is an example of a bad bias amongst historians. If your perspective is creating a blind spot to the historical reality of the people you're studying, you need someone to slap you upside the head and point that out. I mean, we've begun to understand much more about non-Mediterranean ancient civilizations once we stopped assessing them by Greek or Roman standards. So what do I mean when I say Kush is like a Sudanic state? So like the later Sudanic states, it possessed a subsistence economy with low capacity for production and thus very small agricultural surpluses. So this is why you had this very loose form of taxation, because all they really needed was enough to help maintain the royal household and the military. And that was really all they could legitimately ask for. So this means that only a very limited degree of direct control was possible. So this increases the importance of local authorities. So it's also likely that pastoral groups, so people who raised herds and flocks, were semi-nomadic within the state. And this would be even more of a challenge to direct control. Now, likely control was exerted to the degree it could be through palaces and through the temples, because they would have been involved in the distribution and redistribution of goods. Now, the state definitely had military capacity. Even beyond its entanglement with Egypt, there were apparently actions that it took against rebellious groups within the state itself, but it's likely that its army was not a standing army, that it was only raised when required. The king is, however, depicted as a warrior king, as an important part of his identity. But to get to the point for today's lecture, what about the queens? The queens of Meroe also had a rather significant role both in public life and in military life. So let's talk about the Kandake. So Nubian dynasties were matrilineal. What this means is that succession goes to the son of the king's sister. And this is very common in sub-Saharan Africa. Think about the logic of that. A king cannot be 100% sure that any child he has with his wife is in fact his. However, he can be absolutely sure that any child his sister has is hers, and hence related to him. So, if the designated successor is too young, his mother can rule in his place for a time, because she is of the royal line. So she would serve effectively as an absolute ruler. She would look after the temples, she would act in a diplomatic capacity, she would fight if fighting had to be done. Now, the mother as regent is a not uncommon sight in pre-modern societies because she's a natural choice. But it's a little bit more unusual for her to exert full power as the Kandakes did. Now, the regents in Meroe don't seem to have been restricted in any way, and their military roles are quite firmly established. Now, the Royal Cemetery at Meroe, where many of the more important pyramid tombs are found, contains 30 kings and 8 queens. So they're not the majority, but they are important. The other thing to remember is that regency is not the only route to power for a queen. They could also rule in partnership with their husband. There have also been some suggestions that possibly the Kandakes had some sort of unique status independent of their marital relationship, and that they actually cooperated with male co-rulers as part of the governmental structure. But that's a bit fanciful, and we don't really have any historical information to confirm that. Now, in art, they are depicted in a way very similar to how we see male Egyptian rulers depicted. They're killing their enemies in battle. They're being nursed by Isis. I mentioned that these queens are called Kandakes. Okay, this is a bit stupid. Classical writers take this name and they call one queen Candace of Meroe, as if that was her name, and then claim that she passed it down to others, and that's why they were all called Candace, because classical writers are honestly dumbasses sometimes. Now, the only unusual thing is that they are depicted as very large women in Meroitic art, and they've actually been interpreted as obese, but really that is a bit Eurocentric, first of all. And secondly, they're not really depicted as obese, they're just depicted as big. I mean, in some relief sculptures, for instance, they're depicted as the same height as the lion god. And so is that perhaps just some sort of reference to their divine status? Now, the earliest known ruling queen is Kandake, who seems to have ruled on her own and built temples in the 2nd century BCE. She was also praised in inscriptions as a military leader who captured many prisoners and cattle when she made war. One of our most important Kandakes was Amenishiketo, who ruled from 10 BCE to 1 CE. She was buried in a pyramid in Meroe with amazing gold jewelry. Her pyramid was 70 feet tall and originally gilded, and she is depicted on the walls of one temple as holding prisoners by a cord and stabbing one with a knife. In 10 BCE, we know she defeated a Roman attack on Meroe, and she's also depicted in a few pieces of Egyptian art, and in this art she is spearing her enemies, so it's clear that she was known as a warrior. Now, her daughter, Amanitore, was associated with her husband. Both of their names, the husband and the daughter, were related to Amun, which suggests perhaps these are divine rulers. But the queen is depicted in art in a Meroitic temple as attacking her foes with a sword. That was actually her on the title slide. All right, so let's take a close look at what we do actually have in terms of sources. Okay, so Pseudo-Callisthenes is the unknown author or authors of what's called the Alexander Bromance. This is sort of a late antique and medieval adaptation of the stories of the career of Alexander the Great. And supposedly, according to the Alexander Bromance, he visited Queen Candace of Meroe in the 4th century BCE. And the romance tells us that it was a rich land and she was beautiful. Alexander invited her to come sacrifice in the mountains with him, so that's what you call it. She refused, claiming that she believed in God, but she sent him fantastically rich gifts, and he promised to help her out whenever she needed it. Now, he actually does this later when her son's wife is in trouble. But he kind of presumes upon this at one point, and he decides to come and meet her in disguise. When she had sent her original gift to him, she had actually sent an artist, we're told, along with the retinue. And so the artist had created a likeness of him, and she recognized him immediately. So in that version of the romance, she's depicted as incredibly clever, and Alexander is depicted as a pouty little boy because he basically loses it when she outsmarts him, and she just snarks right back at him. It's actually kind of beautiful. She tells him, basically, shut up and I'll keep your secret, because otherwise there are people at my court who would murder you for some of the victories that you had elsewhere. They do have a bit of a fling, but I mean, this is Alexander's legendary adventures, so that was only to be expected. In another version of the story, he invades her land, and she shows up riding a war elephant, at which point he thinks better of it. Now, all of this is fictitious, obviously, or possibly. The details are fictitious. The idea that Alexander had some encounter with Kush, maybe not so fictitious. But what I want to emphasize is that in this source, this woman is depicted as powerful, clever, and beautiful, despite being a barbarian queen. I mean, while these are medieval documents, most of them, I mean, late antique at best, it's telling that she's got this positive portrayal. Now, other sources give us interesting incidental information. The New Testament says a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch who served Candace, was converted by the disciple Philip during a trip to Jerusalem. So, what does this tell us? That trade or diplomatic connections were ongoing at the time? There has to have been, because otherwise, why would he even have been there? Certainly, these connections existing is supported by both archaeology and our written sources. Probably the most famous classical source on these women is Pliny the Elder. So in 60 CE, he wrote about Candace, who ruled Meroe, and about how that name was passed from queen to queen. I don't think he was the first to say that, but I do think he's the one who caused the idea to catch on. He has a reasonably good depiction of Meroe itself. Likely he had details from people who'd actually been there, whether it was as diplomats or travelers. But he gets very fanciful when he moves away from the capital and starts talking about how the people became monstrous the further away from the city they get. So, they would have no tongues, or their mouths grew together so they had to drink through their nostrils. It's wacky, wacky Roman, honestly. Now, the most important reference to the Queens of Meroe in our historical sources is Strabo's discussion of the war between Rome and Kush. This is sometime between 25 and 21 BCE, and apparently the Romans conquered Meroe. This was an extension of Rome's war with Cleopatra and Antony, possibly retaliation for attacks from Meroe. It's a little unclear. The Romans targeted Napata, the old capital, first. They destroyed it. They took slaves. They retreated again, believing they'd taken over a new territory. 2 years later, they are opposed by a Kandake, possibly by the name of Amaranus, who was said to have been blind in one eye. Now, Strabo tells us she was, quote, masculine for a woman and led a much weaker army against the Romans. They took some prisoners, they pulled down some statues, and actually something that's been discovered in digs at Meroe is a bronze head of a statue of what appears to be Augustus, buried beneath the threshold of one of the temples. Now, the assumption is that they did this deliberately. They buried his head underneath the steps leading into the temple so that anyone who entered the temple was insulting Rome by literally stepping on the head of the emperor. It's badass, honestly. Now, Strabo basically implies that they lost the battle eventually. But there's a bit of a question mark because we're not sure. He doesn't come out and say it. He kind of steps around it pretty carefully. I mean, what happens with the negotiations that follow is that the Romans basically give them most of their land back. And they're exempted from taxes that Augustus imposed on other conquered peoples. I mean, let me just be very clear here. Whatever Kandake we're talking about, she negotiated successfully with Augustus. So, does that mean she was decisively defeated? Probably not. But it's really funny to read the passing references to these negotiations in some of our secondary sources, because they so often write off Augustus not hammering her for concessions as, some type of act of mercy or goodwill on his part. I mean, these guys, you've met Augustus, right? Or at least you've met him in the sources that we have of him. It's not part of his character to be gracious and merciful. So Meroe was exempted from tribute, and her authority and sovereignty was guaranteed. This treaty was honored for almost 300 years. At that point, Rome had other problems. Probably part of this has to do with just Meroe being so far away that it's not really productive for Rome to try and conquer it. And probably the original hostilities were over control of trade routes. So if trade is flowing, why bother with warfare? Now, the Kandake herself in inscriptions depicted this as a great victory, claiming that she'd overcome the foreign enemy. And I'm going to be honest here, the evidence is kind of on that side, to be perfectly honest. So, what do we take away from this? The Kandakes had an important role in their society. We're not talking about just like individual talented women who break the mold. No, this is something that is built into their social structure. Of course, the problem is that the Kandakes, our sources on the Kandakes are not from Meroe itself. So this is a challenge. It means that we don't usually see these rather exceptional women clearly. And of course, when you're looking at secondary sources, Eurocentrism is a huge problem. I mean, the obesity thing is a big issue. It's another example of how literal reading of artistic sources is so often a really bad idea. And again, Kush has been neglected. Its contributions to African civilization are misunderstood because it's so often written off as just a reflection of Egypt, when really it's significantly different in its economic organization and its political culture. Now, the way forward, try and see these women from a Meroitic or Kushic perspective. To see them on their own merits means, get their script translated and do some more digging, which is easier said than done, especially given the state that Sudan's in. But at some point, hopefully, we will have more evidence about them. Okay, that should do it for this one. We will be back with the Amazons shortly.